In this example, I want to go through just an overview of Project 3 and how that would work. So with Project 3, if you look on Blackboard, there's a Project 3 sample application. It's a client application, and I've downloaded that application and extracted it. So that's an HTML file that's linked up to a JavaScript file. If I go ahead and start this, so I'm going to go ahead and go live in Visual Studio Code, it looks a little bit like this. And the idea here is that there's a user interface for clients to add new teams, so new team records that would go into our baseball stats table that we've used. So all of this is already wired up. An end user could come in here and add a new team record, and then be able to click the button and we should add a new team. And then likewise, it's also going to populate all the team records and all the player records into these tables down below. So the user interface supports the ability to add a new team, and then it also supports the ability to render all of the teams and all of the player records. Okay, and the idea from that is that all of this data, so all the teams and players, would come from your API. And likewise, this add would also come from your API, the ability to do the add. So if I go over to API Gateway, I have an API set up called Baseball Stats. So if I go to API, I have Baseball Stats set up. And really, I'm only concerned about two of the methods here. So I have delete and get and post and options. I said two, I meant three. The delete is not a concern here. The get is wired up so that it's tied to a Lambda function, which is going to allow me to scan DynamoDB. And post is wired up so that it'll allow me to insert a new record into DynamoDB. There's two corresponding Lambda functions. So the first one is scan DynamoDB, and this is going to return all of my DynamoDB baseball stats records. Okay, and then the second function that we have, so I'll just open this in a new tab, is the put DynamoDB, which will take input from my event object. So it's going to take input from my event object. So I've passed data in from the event object, and then it's going to insert that as a new item into my baseball stats table, and it's going to run a put item command on those parameters. So on the new record that was passed into the function from my client through API Gateway to my Lambda function, and it's going to insert that record. So that's what's wired up to the post command in API Gateway. Okay, so the post is wired up to that put DynamoDB function. Okay, so the idea here is that if I go to the URL of my API, right, so I have this get right here, I can see the URL. If I copy that and head over to a browser, I should be able to see those baseball stats records. Okay, so this is all of my baseball stats records. It includes teams and players and games. So all of those objects that are in my DynamoDB table. Okay, the idea would be that I should be able to take that URL over to my client application, and if I look at the JavaScript at the very top, there's a URL. I should be able to replace that URL with my API's URL. Okay, so I go ahead and save that. So because I've replaced that URL and now I'm going to my API, the idea would be that once I've done that, then this client application would then render the teams and the players. And you'll notice that that's not actually happening, and I can go into some debugging about it, but the truth of the matter is if I go to the JavaScript, you'll see that it's expecting there's the output teams and output players. So if we just look at one of the output functions, it's trying to map over all the players and it's trying to map over all the teams. But if I actually look at what's happening there, it's looking at the baseball stats dot items. So it's looking at the output and expecting an attribute called items to point at this specific array. Okay, so right now we just have the array of data, and it's the client application is expecting that array of data to be called items. So to have an attribute called items that would then point at this array. Okay, so this is a pretty easy fix. I'm actually going to do it through Lambda. So in Lambda, right now I'm returning that array, which is this unmarshaled items. Instead of returning the unmarshaled items, I'm going to return a JavaScript object, that's the curly braces, and then the attribute is going to be called items. And then I'm saying that the items that I'm actually going to return is that array of data that we had before. Okay, so I'm actually modifying the function so that my client application will work correctly. And then I'm going to deploy it. And you'll notice that before I just had the array, that was kind of the root of the element at my API output. And now you'll notice that I have this attribute called items that's pointing at the array. Okay, so I have an object that's a collection of items that's pointing at the array. And now if I go back over to my client application and refresh this, now you'll notice that the teams fill in and the players fill in. Okay. As far as the add goes, the idea would be that whatever I'm passing here, so if I say I want to add a new team, so let's say I wanted to add the Milwaukee Brewers. So I'll just say MLK, the sort key being MLK, and then the team name Milwaukee Brewers. The idea here is that that data that I'm entering there all gets packaged up as a JSON object in the request body, and I'll show you that in the client application. So when I add a new team, you'll notice what happens is I get these parameters, and the team ID, the sort key, and the team name are all grabbed from that HTML user interface, and it's built into a JSON object, and then I'm actually sending that in the request body as JSON. That's what's happening there. Okay, so that data gets passed to my API via a post. Okay, so it gets passed to my API via a post, and then from my post, I have it set up so that in the integration request, I am passing that data through via this mapping template. So that data that I'm passing is my new item. Right? So in my mapping template, I have the data that I passed in the request body from my client application. It's going to be, I'm going to label it as new item, and that's where I'm getting the request body. And then ultimately it lands in my function so that I can grab it out of the event.newItem parameter. And that's where that new record is actually going, and it's going to get inserted into my table. Okay, so if I test this out, so right now the Milwaukee Brewers do not show up as a team, but if I go ahead and hit add team, and it's going to take a second here, but eventually I should get confirmation back. Eventually. And I want to make sure that that is the case. So I'm just going to look at the console. It looks like that's been blocked by my CORS policy, but I have CORS enabled. I wonder if I don't have CORS set up correctly. Right? So that's my guess, is that that's why it failed. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I don't know that I actually have the Brewers there. It looks like I did add the Brewers, so I'm not sure why that actually failed. Let's go ahead and try a different team. UW Madison. Right, or Badgers, whatever you want to call it, but I'm calling it UW Madison. I just want to look in the console when I add the team. Okay, eventually I do fail here, and I'm not sure why I'm failing. I want to look at the network traffic. So when I try to do a post, it's failing with a CORS error, but it is doing the insert. That's interesting. What I think is happening is if I look at my options, okay, so I look at my options, the way my method response is set up is I have the CORS headers set up. But then if I look at the integration response, I am allowing get options and post. I was thinking that the post was going to be disabled, and it doesn't look like it is. So that's interesting that it is showing up that way. And I do have, so the post is failing on line 34. But I'm confident that the UW-Madison record got added, and I'm able to fetch. So it's just the post that's failing. So when I add a new team, I'm getting a response, and I'm not actually using that response. I'm just taking the input parameters that the user entered. So I'm not sure why that's failing there. But it's complaining about this fetch and my post. I don't think this would matter, but I'm just going to make it case sensitive there. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the API that I have that I'm actually looking at is the one that's actually deployed. Okay, so now that it's there, I'm going to monitor the network traffic. So I want to add a new record, and I'm going to call this one the Madison Mallards. And I'm looking at the network traffic right now, and I'm still getting a CORS error on that fetch. I'm going to just try to re-enable CORS on my API. I'm not sure what CORS error I have. I'm going to go ahead and delete the options. And then at the root of my API, I'm going to enable CORS. And I'm going to enable all of the different HTTP verbs. So options is there. I'm going to redeploy the API. Okay. And then now that I've redeployed the API, it should be updated. Now I want to test this one more time. So I'm going to go over to my client application. And I'm going to use the Verona Wildcats. And I'm going to clear the network traffic. And I must have done something incorrect with CORS, because now you'll notice that my CORS status is coming back okay. And if I look, the Verona Wildcats is getting added successfully. So I must have had a CORS setting incorrect in my API. I was able to debug it, and the client application is now working. So I really shouldn't have to modify the client application other than the URL. So the only thing that I'm going to modify with the client application is I'm going to change the URL to match what my API gateway URL is. And then once I've done that, then I have to make sure that my API supports a couple of things. It's going to have to support getting all of the stats via an HTTP GET, and then it's also going to have to support adding a new record via a post. And then lastly, it's going to have CORS enabled so that my JavaScript client application can then talk to the API, because they're on different domains. So right now my client application is on my local host domain, and then the API is on an Amazon assigned domain name. Okay, so at the end of the day, we should be able to render out players and teams, and then also be able to add new team records. Okay, so the client application really shouldn't have to be modified other than you plugging in the URL of your API. Okay, and then your API may need some work because, like I said, it does require that your API returns all of the baseball stats as items, right? So we have that items attribute kind of preceding the array of data. So that's one of the requirements. But really that's it. So that's what I'm looking for Project 3 is that you have an API that supports those different HTTP verbs, and that your client application is then able to access those HTTP verbs via HTTP GET and POST, and that it's successful because you've also enabled CORS and you're successfully passing data from your client application all the way through to your two Lambda functions that you would have that would support the GET and POST.